Greetings, students. I hope this video finds you doing well. I'm doing okay, and I'm here to talk to you some more about one of my favorite subjects, Taoism. So let's pick it up right where we left off. You'll recall the definition we went over last time, that ancient Chinese philosophy is an historical humanism characterized by radical immanence that seeks for human greatness through an inclusive methodology. And last time we talked about how it was an historical humanism, and we also looked at a few of the rival schools to Taoism and how Taoists critique them. Now we want to think about this idea that this kind of philosophy is characterized by radical immanence, which means there's no metaphysical transcendence, and that it operates in terms of what we can call the coincidence or coincidence of opposites. My claim is that these ways of thought preclude the existence of any transcendent being or principle in the classical Western sense. And we want to see if we can come to understand what I mean by that. Now, one disclaimer or caveat, I'm talking about classical Taoism, right? The philosophy of classical Taoism as exhibited in the Tao Te Ching. Taoism also goes through a long history in China. It develops in terms of religion, and different kinds of ways of thinking come to be attached to it. But here I'm simply looking at the text of the Tao Te Ching and trying to think about it in terms of what we see there. And it's important to see that the Tao, at least in classical Taoism, is not a transcendent principle. And that will give us a very interesting kind of philosophy to think about indeed. Because the point to see is the Tao is not some sort of energy field pervading everything, right? It's something very different that's so very interesting and offers a kind of alternative way of thinking. So first, let me just give you a logical definition of transcendence so you know exactly what I'm talking about. When we say X transcends Y, what do we mean? Well, a principle X is transcendent with respect to that which serves as its principle Y if the meaning of Y cannot be fully explained without X, but the reverse is not true. An example can help make this definition clear. Let X equal God in the classical theistic conception. Now, the classical theistic conception of God is simply God as understood in the traditions of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. That there's a personal God who transcends space and time and has created the entire universe and is absolutely independent of it. Right? So, God is transcendent with respect to that which it serves as principle, or the world, right? If the meaning of the world cannot be fully explained without God, but the reverse is not true. We claim God transcends the world or the universe. And that means that the meaning of the created universe cannot be understood without God. But God does not need the universe to be God. The meaning of God, as understood in the classical theistic sense, is that than which none greater can be conceived, and which is absolutely independent, and upon which the physical created universe is absolutely dependent. Now, it's important to see that this would be true of a God beyond the world, outside of it, as well as a God, so to speak, within it. Like someone might say God is in everything. But God still would be transcending everything God is within. So it's important to see that that's a form of transcendence too. In theism, God is outside the world holding it together, while if you had a view where God is sort of inside the world holding it together, that God would still be a transcendent principle. And in both cases, there would be transcendence in the logical sense, because this God in the world would also be metaphysically beyond it. And in both cases, problems arise. Right? If God is logically distinct from the world, or somehow identical with it and still God, how are we to account for the parts and the diversity yet have a unity. This is the old metaphysical problem in the West of the one and the many. In both theism and pantheism, the problem arises: how are we as individuals, how is anything as an individual real? The world is radically contingent, is sort of swallowed up in the transcendent, and becomes either absolutely dependent on it or just some kind of illusion. And the world becomes totally devalued. In Christianity, for example, St. Francis, who is famous for valuing nature, is often misunderstood as if he were some sort of nature lover. But Francis thought that all the created things were like windows or paths to get at God, who was what was really important, because God transcended the world. So for St. Francis, the flowers, the trees, and nature are important because they're like little portals or doorways that can take us up to the transcendent God. And you can see then how nature is being devalued, because all that matters is this transcendent principle of the divine. Now, I explained all that just to say this: none of that whole conceptual heritage applies to trying to understand what is meant by Tao. The Tao is neither a transcendent principle outside creation or a transcendent force pervading all creation. The Tao is not a transcendent principle at all. The Tao is not a thing. And to understand the Tao, you have to deal with opposites and not parts. Instead, we speak of what we could call, borrowing from medieval alchemy, who in the West, right, have a kind of Eastern view of this. Like I said, the philosophy is not necessarily geographical, but represents a state of mind. And in the idea of the coincidence of opposites, you have the idea that opposites can come to be in accord. They can come to be in agreement. They can come to be in harmony. And so they coincide. Coincidence means things occur with each other. And the idea is the opposites naturally occur with each other. I like how Alan Watts puts this, the great philosopher, in my mind. He says, opposites goes with each other. He invents a word for this. They goes with each other. Like you could say yin goes with yang. An opposite goes with another. Yin goes with yang. There is an exact agreement or accord or concord. And the important thing is, there is no, it should be no, there is no third thing or force holding the opposites together. There is a concurrence of events having no apparent causal connection. And the point is, we don't look for some third thing or principle transcendent to the events to connect them. There is no third thing. There is no force of pervading it. There's no God looking down uniting it. The two events just goes with each other. Or, as is said, they require each other. They mutually require each other. There is, in fact, as the medieval alchemists put it, a conjunction of opposites, a kind of organic unity. In 1541, Copeland, in a text of his called Guidance Rest, said, "How many conjunctions of bones be in the hand, and how many bones in every conjunction?" Right? I mean, this all seems full of opposites and things that don't really go together, all the little bones and tendons, but they're a unity. They're a real unity. And a body seems made up all of dissimilarity that is nonetheless a unity. It seems, in fact, to be full of opposites when they go together. There is, in fact, a conjunction of opposites, right? The right and left hand are unified in the clap. And here you have the answer to something you've always wondered about. What is the sound of one hand clapping? That's the sound of one hand clapping, right? So if yin is A and yang is B, there's no third thing holding them together. The opposites just exist as opposites together, Yin goes with yang, and there's no higher synthesis, no higher category to reconcile the opposition or to dissolve it or make it go away. Yet the opposites cannot exist apart. For if one ceases to exist, so does the other. And if one comes into existence, the other does too. In the Tao Te Ching it says, say beauty and ugliness is born. So here's the famous yin and yang symbol, and I've heard people explain it in a way that's wrong. And it reveals a misunderstanding. Let me explain what I mean. I've heard some people say, well, here's yin and here's yang, and this line going down the middle is the Tao, which holds them together. But what you want to see is there's nothing holding yin and yang together. There's nothing. There's no third thing. The Tao is no thing. The Tao is a word that is a finger pointing at the moon of the fact that opposites just goes with each other. And there's no force or principle that's holding them together. It's just the way things are. It's the great natural way that opposites goes with each other. And basic problems that plague Western metaphysics, then, need not ever arise in this way of thought. And there's no need for us to import them in, right? All kinds of problems that arise don't need to arise because the principles that cause the problem aren't there. Consider a classic problem with me from Western metaphysics. In Plato's so-called theory of ideas, we have the notion, for example, if I look at one man and I look at another man, how do I know they're both men? Well, I have the idea of man. And looking at the idea, I can see that they're both men, right? But that gives rise to a problem. And just as a sort of footnote, I called this Plato's so-called theory of ideas because Plato, in fact, wrote plays. And in one of his plays, called the Parmenides, he presents this critique of his theory of ideas. Right? And really, can you say Plato had a theory if a character in a play put forth the theory? Plato was a slippery fellow. But in any case, given this so-called theory of ideas, if there's some idea of man by which I can identify this as a man and this as a man, the problem arises. How do I know that the idea of man and this man are similar? Well, I need another idea of man at a sort of higher level to show me that this is like this, and similarly that this is like this. But then how do I know this idea is like this idea? Well, I need this idea. And it begins to multiply, and it goes on forever. It goes off into infinity and causes, in modern terms, what we call a blue screen error. It just sort of freezes the mind up, because that just doesn't make any sense. So, suppose the yin and the yang need the Tao to hold them together. Well, the same problem would arise, wouldn't it, if the Tao is some third thing? If the Tao is what holding these two together, then what's holding the Tao and this together? Or helping it to relate? And how does this relate? And how does this relate? And it would go on to infinity too. There's a problem with these third things that a philosophy of what my professor used to call oppositology, sort of the logos of the opposites, doesn't require. Because in the text we're reading, there's literally no thing apart from the opposites. There's just yin and yang, and they goes with each other, right? And we too, for example, are opposites in conjunction, body and mind. In Western metaphysics, there's this real problem. How does body relate to mind? What holds body and mind together? Are there a unity? And the traditional move in Western thought is to pick one side or the other and just ignore the opposite, right? Well, maybe we're all body, and the brain can just be explained in a material sense, or maybe we're just all mind, and it can all be explained in a spiritual, mental sense. And in both cases, there's a problem. What's going to be holding everything together? And the modern Western orientation hates that. They hate the idea that there are things you can't control And so they create a theory to obliterate the opposition. So the way body and mind are related is not found in something over and beyond these opposites like a soul, nor is one side of the pair privileged over the other to make it a sort of unifying principle. But what we are is more like a point of balance between the opposites. What we call our individual self is more like a vector. If you're familiar with vectors from physics, right? You take two magnitudes, like say velocity and time, and you plot it, right? And you get this vector, right? Now, wouldn't it be strange? I mean, because this is meant to represent a ball that's rolling down a hill, right? And you plot its vector. Right? Now, what would be strange is if you thought that this vector pattern actually existed, right? Right? Well, you can think of a self, if you wish, as some third thing between body and mind, but there's no such thing. It's just like a line on a graph. It's just a way of talking to point a finger at the moon of the ball rolling down the hill, or the self that I take myself to be. There is no thing apart from the opposite. So you don't seek to unify yin and yang, or heaven with earth, through finding some third thing to unite them. And you don't seek to unify them by taking one side of the opposition and subsuming the other into it by making it the supreme category. Instead, you seek the point of balance and the harmony of the opposites. And it's important to see that balance or harmony is not equal to synthesis. In synthesis, the opposites disappear into the higher category, which is then said to be the reality of the two things. And this way of thinking, the opposites remain distinct. So in our text, we'll find all kinds of paired opposites. And the thing to do is to try to understand each pair on its own terms, trying to sense how they goes with each other and how they balance each other and mutually require each other. But in the West, to understand means to categorize, to break things down into components and then into subcomponents until we can put each part into its proper category and subcategory, striving above all else to avoid contradiction and paradox. What's most real about being human, say? If we want to think about what's real about being human, we break human experience down into, say, the categories of the mind system and the body system. And then you must ask, how are they related? What connects them? Or which one are we really? And no psychologist or scientist would really be historically satisfied with the answer that we're both this and that we're both, and that nothing holds these opposites together, and that there's no solution because there's no problem. So classically in the West, we have materialists saying, well, we're really all matter, like in cognitive science and eliminative materialism. While idealists are out of fashion now, though they still exist, say it's all a mind. And then each has the problem of explaining how stubborn mind-like phenomena are really only matter, or vice versa. And really, there's a whole cottage industry on this, all these puzzles of body and mind. I became an expert in these. I had to. I got tested on it in my PhD philosophy training. And you'll have whole courses taught on what is called the mind-body problem. And if you go into one search in the library and just type in mind-body problem, you'll see countless books and journal articles. You can probably go online and find YouTube videos of people teaching about the mind-body problem and websites on it. And the Western orientation is fascinated with this seeming paradox and wants to solve it. They want to solve it. You want to take one side of the opposition and collapse everything into it, and explain everything in terms of it, and explain away the contradiction that haunts you, the seeming contradiction of human consciousness, which seems so different from body, and yet body seems so different from consciousness or awareness. But the text we're reading accept the paradox, or rather, there's no paradox. There's only a paradox from the point of view that doesn't understand that opposites goes with each other, right? To try to resolve that into some unified theory, to try to eliminate the paradox, makes no sense. And in this way of thinking, they would think you were mad if you tried to eliminate it. Though again, from this point of view, there's no paradox because the whole conceptual heritage that creates the paradox is non-existent. So we come to the third and fourth part of our definition, right? That these philosophies seek human greatness through an inclusive methodology. Now, in this kind of philosophy, theory and practice go with each other. There's no such thing as good in theory, because good in theory means good in practice. And that idea should be familiar to you from the Upanishads, and I said in my opening lectures that this will be generally true of all the philosophies we look at, right? So there's no real, as it were, professional philosophers in the Western academic sense in this kind of philosophy. If you go into ancient China, you have reformers, you have administrators, you have artists, you have hermits who are trying to transform their life. But the ultimate justification of the philosophy is found in the quality of life you end up living. Right? And what the aim of the philosophy is, as they put it, is not to understand the world, but to make people great. So no understanding for understanding's sake, theory, right? Even in Taoism, you pay attention to nature to transform the self, and the metaphysics and the ethics always go together. There's no metaphysics without ethics, and there's no ethics without metaphysics. You could think of metaphysics and ethics united in a sort of yin-yang symbol, right? And so the aim of the philosophy is to make you great. But what does it mean to become great? Well, it means to have inner peace, completeness, or balance, and in the outer sense, to live well practically, right? To have enough to eat, to drink, to take care of yourself, right? And to be able to flourish in the world. And this leads to what we could call an inclusive methodology. Since practice is inseparable from theory, the ultimate justification of philosophy is found in the character and life of the philosopher. So the question you asked when thinking about a philosophy is, does the philosophy transform the philosopher into a great person who flourishes in both an inner and outer sense? And this means if views are opposed, they must go with each other in a fundamental way. Well, let me jump up on the board and correct there we go. If views are opposed, they must go with each other in a fundamental way. The differences are what we call complementary. Now notice here, nota bene, complementary with an E does not mean complementary with an I. I'm always finding students confusing these two in essays that they write in every class I've ever taught in every subject area. You want to get clear on what these two words mean. So, part of your assignment for class this week is to go look up the two words so you can tell me the difference when I call on you. And if you can't, I'll take a point off your grade. Well, maybe 0.05 points, or maybe 0.0005 points. Well, anyway, I want you to know the difference between the two words so you don't look like a miseducated fool when you leave Eckerd. In any case, when differences are complementary with an E, it's not A and B are opposites, so pick one or the other, but A and B are opposites, so you need to balance or harmonize both. Right? So this gives a practical attitude, a broad tolerance, and a sort of pragmatic attitude toward the different philosophies and religions and practices. So in China, you have a sort of grouping called Neo-Confucianism, which means Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism all are sort of coming together in ways that make practical sense. Let me give you an example. When Western missionaries first came to China to try to preach Christianity and convert the heathens, right? They thought things were going well. For example, they'd have all these people coming to church and sitting there, and they would also help people out. They'd give them food to eat, and they're like good Christians, and they'd have doctors and help them. And then one day a missionary would be wandering down the street, and they'd find what they thought to be their devout convert going into the Buddhist hall to meditate or seek advice from the Buddhist master. Or they might find them going into a Taoist temple to seek advice from a Taoist priest. And that would confuse them, and they would think these people were inconsistent, not understanding this idea. Because when you think about it in this way, you'd think, well, some situations I find myself in are Buddhist situations, and they require a Buddhist solution. Other situations I find myself in might require a Taoist way of approach. And then there are even other situations I might find my way in that go best with a Christian way of approach. And it's not like all these things are opposites, so you need to pick one or the other and just stick to it and make it this one category that obliterates every other one. But that A and B are opposites, or A and B and C are all opposed in some way, and you need to balance them or harmonize them to bring them together. Okay? And there's nothing holding them together. They just goes with each other. So as I said last time with the Indian philosophies, it's a whole beautiful continent of thought, thousands of years of all kinds of fascinating, brilliant people thinking about what is most real and how to live in the light of it, practicing philosophy. And just like with Indian philosophy, we don't have time to go into everything. So what I'm choosing to go into in this case is classical Taoism as found in the Tao Te Ching in Chuangzi. And I could spend all semester just on Lao Tzu. I could spend all semester just on Chuangzi, but that's not the nature of our class. But what I hope you get a glimpse of is a whole other beautiful world of thought, another glittering continent of philosophy that puts me in awe. And we have the privilege of thinking about it together for the next 3 weeks, and I look forward to doing that with you. So thank you for your kind attention, and I'll be talking to you again soon.